Welcome to Whisk, where we give you a quick peek at the day's top stories. I'm Julia Manchester, in for Jamal Simmons. Former President Jimmy Carter was hospitalized last night. He is reported to be in recovery with no complications. This follows another recent hospitalization. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick seems to be considering a late entry for a 2020 presidential bid. He said he would not run last December, but he may be testing the waters. We'll watch for more developments on that. Until then, the Supreme Court hears the case surrounding the Deferred Action for childhood arrivals. Democrats are suing battleground states over restrictive election laws. And the unrest in Hong Kong continues. This is why you should care. The fate of DACA recipients is in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, justices heard arguments in 3 cases seeking to end President Trump's 2017 executive action, which stopped an Obama-era program called the Deferred Action for childhood arrivals, commonly known as DACA. The program grants immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children permission to live and work in the country. President Trump, who ran on tougher immigration policies, has argued all along that DACA is unconstitutional. At the heart of the argument is whether Trump's administration provided adequate and lawful reasoning for canceling DACA, which grants over 500,000 immigrants legal protections. Back in 2017, the administration announced the repeal through a memo, which 3 lower courts ruled was not a strong enough argument for rescinding DACA. The courts eventually ruled against it. That's how these cases ended up before the Supreme Court today. This morning, President Trump attacked DACA recipients, also called Dreamers, in a series of tweets. He wrote, quote, "Many of the people in DACA, no longer very young, are far from angels. Some are very tough, hardened criminals. But the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services data shows that with nearly 1 million Dreamers, only a little over 2,000 had their DACA benefits stripped due to criminal activity. Here's why you should care. Immigration has been a partisan issue spanning several administrations. Despite the back and forth from both sides of the aisle in Congress, lawmakers have yet to come up with a solution for illegal immigrants living in the country. It's now up to the Supreme Court to decide what will happen to hundreds of thousands of Dreamers. A decision is expected next June. A year before the 2020 presidential election, Democrats are challenging laws in key battleground states. These Democratic groups who have filed suits in states where they say election laws and procedures impact young and minority voters more than other voters. Here to tell us more about this is The Hill's national political correspondent, Reid Wilson. Thank you so much for joining, my friend. Yeah, so just tell me where these lawsuits are really coming from and what states they're targeting in particular.
So we've seen 7 lawsuits filed in the last few weeks in 5 states across the country: Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, Arizona, and Michigan. And a lot of these lawsuits, they're not the real sexy ones about redistricting or voter ID or things like that. They're about sort of sub-issues that still impact the way people vote. A lot of them have to do with ballot order. In what order do the candidates actually show up on the ballot? In a lot of states, it's the party that won the previous election gets to show up first. Well, according to social science research, that can have about a 2% impact on a lot of these candidates in a race where some people are unknown. That can make a big difference in a state like Arizona or North Carolina or even Texas that will be really closely contested. Some other lawsuits that have been filed regard signature matching. When you sign your absentee ballot, if your signature doesn't match the signature that's on file with the state elections office, they can throw your ballot out. In Georgia last year, 3% of all absentee ballots, is about 8,000 votes, were thrown out. There were some elections in Georgia that were decided by less than 8,000 votes. So all in all, these make a small difference around the edges, but I think it tells you a little bit about the landscape where Democrats think they're going to be fighting the big fights. They're not necessarily in Wisconsin and Ohio, the places that we've been talking about in recent years. Now the real battleground is moving sort of south to that Sun Belt region: North Carolina, Texas, Arizona.
And what is the likelihood of these lawsuits being successful ahead of 2020?
Well, the reason that they're all being filed now, a year out, is basically to give the courts time to work through them. There have been some other similar suits that have been successful in recent years, others that haven't. I mean, it sort of depends on how the path these lawsuits take through the courts. The Democrats I talked to, they feel really strongly about the merits of their case, but a year out, they need them decided before Election Day. A lot of courts have been skeptical of making big changes to election laws in the weeks and months before an election, saying it could lead to confusion.
Moving on to the actual 2020 Democratic primary, it seems like it could get a bit more crowded in the near future. Deval Patrick is signaling that he would like to get into the race. What does this say that you have figures like Michael Bloomberg and Deval Patrick thinking about entering this very crowded field? Is there actually any room for them?
It says that this election is going to be just as similar as many other elections in previous years. Let's not forget Wesley Clark joining the race back in 2004 when everybody was worried that John Kerry wasn't going to be able to beat Howard Dean in the primary. Wesley Clark didn't exactly go anywhere. Rudy Giuliani himself joined the race real late in 2008, ended up retrenching before finally dropping out. Fred Thompson was another late entrance. This happens all the time. This is the Democratic Party is great at wetting the bed and being worried about not being able to win an election, but these late entrants, they never really go anywhere. There are a lot of candidates who have been making their case to primary voters for a year. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris both got into the race. Warren on December 31st and Harris in mid-January. All of the real serious contenders have been in this race, building the operations necessary to win early states, build momentum. This Michael Bloomberg strategy of skipping the early states and waiting until Super Tuesday, that's really tough to pull off when the news drumbeat is going to be constantly candidate X won in Iowa, candidate Y won in New Hampshire, candidate Z won in South Carolina. That builds momentum that Mike Bloomberg is not going to be a part of.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Reid.
You got it.
It's been 5 months since the anti-government corruption protests in Hong Kong erupted. Negotiations between the protesters and the Chinese government are at a standstill, and violence continues to escalate. A police officer shot a student protester yesterday. The police public relations branch defended the officer's action in a press briefing. The spokesperson said, quote, "Under these conditions, the act of drawing his revolver did not deviate from the guidelines. That is to protect himself and others." The student sustained non-life-threatening injuries, but the violence did not stop there. A man was set on fire after getting into an argument with fellow protesters just hours after the shooting. Amid the chaos, a 22-year-old protester died this past Friday after falling from the 3rd floor of a parking garage. And the violence is not showing any signs of slowing down. Universities have suspended classes, students have set subway stations on fire, and they've resorted to throwing gasoline bombs and barricaded themselves in buildings while attempting to escape police's tear gas. So why should you care? The protests started in June after calls were made to change the extradition policy between mainland China and Hong Kong. Demands for more democracy and freedom from Beijing have also been at the center of the demonstrations. As activists continue to call for Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam's resignation, China is digging in its heels and blaming Western democracies for fueling the protesters' fire.
Thanks for watching Hill TV on YouTube. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we post new videos. And head to thehill.com for all the latest political news.